introduction. So yes, I spent most of my life in Minnesota until about 11 months ago when I moved here to take a job as the director of Allen's Centennial Garden. So I'll tell you a little bit about the garden and what's been going on. But first, a little bit of more academic background. I guess that's related to my dissertation research and museum studies more broadly. So overview, we'll talk about what is Allen's Centennial Garden in case you haven't been there before and you don't know what it is, or if you want to know more. And then second, we'll talk about the of, by, for, and all principles, which is something the garden was working on before I came and that I've continued. And then I'll give you some examples of how we've applied those at Allen's Centennial Garden. So the Allen's Centennial Garden is about 2.5 acres. And it's part of the horticulture department. It's their teaching garden. So our official mission statement is that we are an artful living laboratory and public botanical garden of the horticulture department. And we serve as an outdoor classroom for students and the surrounding communities, people of all ages. This is a picture of our rock garden, which is award-winning. It's one of the best rock gardens in the Midwest. And it's we have an excellent group of volunteers who help us out with the rock garden many hours every week during the growing season. And people come from all over to get a look at it. Much better than the rock garden at the Minnesota Landscape. All right, and yeah, so I went over for a tour at Old Brook, and the director of horticulture there was like, "I'm just not going to show you our rock garden right now because yours is great." So. Allen's Centennial Garden is in this red circle over there, which is adjacent to this orange box on this map, which is actually a habitation site. So there was to be a mound there, and that whole area was a place where Indigenous people lived thousands of years ago. So we know people have lived in and around the garden for thousands of years. And so we are trying to increasingly recognize that as we develop the land and think about how we want to talk about some of the different gardens that we have. So we'll come back to that a little bit later, but this is just to say that we are not the first keepers of this land, and there are many people, even before the university was there, who tended plants and survived in cooperation with the land. So Allen's Centennial Garden has, well, 3 names. We already talked about the garden versus gardens part of it. It has plants in it. The first part is named for Ethel and Oscar Allen, who were the major donors to start the garden. Ethel and Oscar were both faculty members at the University of Wisconsin, and they worked on primarily legumes and plants. There's a fascinating oral history interview that the University Archives did that's available online, and it's all about how when they lived in Hawaii, they were there during Pearl Harbor. And so they were doing research, and then their research changed. And there's a whole bunch of just different interesting stories about that. But in any case, Ethel loved plants and botany. She also loved and supported her husband in his career. All of their papers were co-published, so she had a really amazing career as a female researcher too. And she donated quite a bit of money to start the garden after her husband died. And Allen's Centennial Garden opened in 1989 with the help of her donation. The other half, the centennial part, comes from the Department of Horticulture, which was celebrating its 100th anniversary in 1989. So that's where the 2 parts of our name come from. And this is a nice overhead shot of the garden. It's a few years old, so there are definitely some things that have changed. But like I was telling Tom, it's a garden of many different gardens. So we were counting. I think there's like 21 different smaller gardens within. So down here in the southwest corner, so if north here is the lake. If you go east, you'll go towards the center of campus, towards the Union. And then if you go west here, you'll end up first at Joe Call and then to the medical school. We have a rock garden, a pond. We'll talk a little bit later about the Italian garden and the English garden. This is the French garden, although this hedge is no longer with us. So it looks a little bit different if you're there in person on the ground. And then it'd be remiss if I didn't mention the house. So this space was originally, I guess, the yard or the farm surrounding the agricultural dean's residence. So that building was built in the 1890s for the first dean of the College of Agriculture. His name was Henry, so his last name was Henry, and he had lots of other job offers. So he convinced the regents to increase his salary and build him a house on campus. He was one of 4 deans who lived in the house, and the last of whom was E.B. Fred, who I hear is sort of a household name around here. He was only dean for 2 years, but he moved into the house in 1943, became university president in 1945, but he didn't move out until 1979 or 1980, which is when he died. So he really liked the house. He liked being on campus. There were a lot of perks to that. He lived there for a long time. And then after that, it was offices until about 2010, when the university decided they might remodel it into something else. And since then, it's sort of been in a constant state of, maybe we'll get funding to remodel different something, but we still can't go in it and we can't use it. And it's just sort of an empty building at this point.
Oh.
So that's like the #1 question I get asked in general and also at this kind of thing. So I'll just head that off right away. But we do have gardens surrounding the house. And to speak to the indigenous piece, to the north, where all those tall trees are, that's our Wisconsin woodland garden, which has a lot of native Wisconsin plants. And now we also have a prairie garden in this area here, which again has a lot of native grassland plants. All right. So again, this is another rendition of the map, shows a lot of those same gardens. And again, the number of different gardens. I was laughing, somebody was like, oh, you know, it's not updated. We have this new American garden, which is on the far corner over there. I was like, well, actually, if you look at the guidebook, #2 says lawn and New American Garden. So that's not to count individual gardens, just different spaces. And right now we have 2 main garden staff members, me as the director, and we have a relatively new program manager who Tom got to meet this week, Ryan, who's doing all of our programs and events. And he's also managing our horticulture for the interim. And then we have amazing students who help us. So Nick and Isaac, and then we have additional horticulture, education and programs. And this year we have a photography and design intern. And they all make everything we do in the summer possible. And we have fantastic donors who can sponsor those internships and opportunities for those students to learn how to be garden professionals. And it's really exciting and dynamic to have them around all of the time. They're also a really key part of our partnering with students to develop programs, and I'll come back to that later. All right, so here's the question. Let's say you're going to go visit a botanical garden or maybe some other kind of museum. Maybe imagine in your head the last time you did that. Why did you go? What were your goals or ideas? Who did you bring with you? What did you bring with you into that experience? And so I'm going to continue this exercise so you can continue to ponder, but this is based on some research by John Falk, who is a museum studies researcher, and he has done a lot of work about identity and the museum visitor experience that we're going to learn a little bit more about now. All right, so imagine you're visiting a garden. This is Allen's Centennial Garden with its beautiful pond and this maple tree. So if you've ever been in the garden, you might recognize this area, but you might not know that this maple tree is actually 2 maple trees. When they brought them in, they planted them both right next to each other. So it looks like it's 1 tree, but in the fall, sometimes one will go change color before the other half. So it's like a tree of 2 halves. All right, so there are 5 different types of museum visitors. So thinking back to yourself the last time you were at a museum, we'll see if this profile matched you. Did you visit maybe to enjoy the changing seasons or just relax and get away from it all? Just have a little bit of time to relax and refresh. We have people do this a lot in the garden, and it's something that happens more in gardens than almost any other kind of museum. So maybe that was you. Maybe you went by yourself or with one other person and you wandered around quietly. Alternatively, and if you did, you can remember this Bucky statue. We'll bring him back again later. Perhaps instead, your family members came and you wanted to show them one of your favorite places, or you were watching your grandkids or your kids for a weekend, and you wanted to bring them and do something fun and educational with them. This is kind of like the tour guide situation where you're trying to make somebody else feel like they're going to have a good experience. So type 2. Type 3, maybe you're in a new town and you want to go to the top 10 places that were on the guide for places you should definitely visit when you're in Chicago. Or maybe one of your friends or family members recommended, here is the best place to go when you're in New York City, and that's why you went. Option number 3. Number 4, maybe you went to the garden because you are a home gardener and you really wanted to know what perennials they were planting this year, what the hottest new plants were. Maybe you wanted to talk to a gardener about what to do about those pesky jumping worms or Japanese beetles in your garden. Or maybe you were trying to check off a rare bird on your ornithology list. And then type number 5, this is the last one. Maybe you visited because you wanted to see what was new at the garden. So you go once a year, every year to the Chazen because you want to see the new exhibit. Or you wanted to see, just try out a new experience, do something you've never done before, or check off something on your bucket list. That's type number 5. Okay, so you might be thinking, sometimes I'm different ones of these, but that's okay. I'm going to go into detail about the official type names for each one of them. So the first type would be a recharger. You're going to relax and get to know maybe a little more about yourself and enjoy the space. Type number 2 would be a facilitator. Again, you're facilitating somebody else's experience, something meaningful. A lot of times this happens with children, right? Like, oh, they're off on spring break. What can I do to make them happy or give them something they wouldn't otherwise have? Type 3 was experience seeker. Type 4 would be hobbyist or professional. So this is kind of the joke, but like once you're a museum professional, you can't ever have fun in a museum. You have to go and like compare the label text and, oh, why did they put the path in that way? All of these like little things. There's this Twitter profile. It's all called Dull Museum Snaps, which is just like museum professionals taking a picture of something that like nobody else would notice in the museum. It looks ridiculous, but it was like a cool shelving unit or something else. So that's kind of the nitty gritty. Or explorer. You just want to satisfy your personal curiosity and learn as much as possible. So this is the kind of person that reads every single sign when they're in the museum. And that's actually a very small portion of people who go to the museum. Although exhibit designers wish that was everyone, right? But that's actually a small portion. So when we design things for the garden or a museum, we have to keep in mind all of these different groups of people and to think about how to have their needs met. And sometimes they're in competition, right? So if you want to be in the garden to be a recharger and have a quiet space, and somebody else is coming and they want their grandchildren to have a really fun time at the garden, sometimes noisy grandchildren are not a really good combination with somebody trying to have a relaxing stroll, for one example. Or maybe somebody really wants to have all of the information out about a particular kind of jumping worm, whereas somebody else just wants to have a cool picture they can show their family member or something. Those are all different pieces that can't always be satisfied. One size fits all. So what do we do about that? And the other important thing to keep in mind is that when we say a garden is for everyone, if we don't dig into that a little bit more, it can mean that a garden is for the people that the garden has always been for. So if we say, everyone can come to a garden, that's true. Our garden is free, it's open to the public. Everyone can come there, but not everyone feels like they're welcome. And if we keep doing the same things that we've always done, they're going to continue to feel not so welcome. And this goes to another book that's generally available online. It's a really quick read. It's called The Art of Relevance, and I think it applies to more things than just botanical gardens or museums. But basically, the idea is that number one, you need to convince whoever you want to come into your space that you are relevant. So this sort of comes with advertising or inviting them to things they might want to do. And the second thing is you need to actually be relevant once they get there, right? So you have to feel like yes, I want to go to the museum today. And then when you get to the museum, you have to feel like your needs are met. So if the first thing you do when you show up to the museum is need to go to the bathroom, and there's no bathroom, then we have a disconnect and a problem. And there are many other examples of that, right? So like if you came because the advertising was in Spanish and you wanted to bring your Spanish speaking parents to this exhibit, and then you show up and all the labels are only in English, that's another disconnect. And those are just some of the basic ones. There's a lot of them where I wouldn't know what the disconnect is because I'm not a member of the group that I'm trying to represent. So Nina gives an example in her book about surfers. So when she was at the Santa Cruz Museum, they discovered in their collection these really old surfboards. And it turned out they were the first surfboards that had ever been in California. People had brought them over from Hawaii and they were like the Genesis object. And they were like, all right, well, this is cool. Maybe we should invite the surfing community. They don't usually come to the museum. We'd like to attract them. And, how can we plan something with them? Well, I don't know anything about surfing. She didn't know anything about surfing. So she had to invite the surfers in to help figure out what they wanted. And they went so they decided they were going to go to the beach and have this whole ceremony to take them out of the box and then try them out in the water. And all of these cool things that the museum had never done before. But the only way they could figure that out was to actually talk to the community, because I don't know what you want to do on a Friday afternoon unless you tell me. That's not obvious, and it's not something that I've done before. And so this is what has been transformed into this organization called Of, By, For, All, which is really hard to say unless you have the words in front of you. It all kind of mushes together and your brain gets confused. But this nonprofit was also started by Nina. And the idea here is that when you're planning things in the exhibit space, you want things to come of the community. That means the community comes to you with an idea and they create it, or they're planned by the community, or you plan them for a specific community. So when we say all, it doesn't mean that everything you do applies to everyone, but it means that by working with the community, we can make these things happen. And so I'm going to give you some more examples of this happening at Allen Centennial Garden, kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So one of the key things that we've done is partner with the interns to empower them to lead and learn and make their own decisions. We pay them. Some people are surprised that we have paid internships. I think it's becoming more popular these days, but we want them to be able to devote their time and their energy to the things that they're doing in the garden and not be pulled in a bunch of different directions. And we also want to be able to attract students that couldn't spend their whole summer not being paid. And then we really focus on developing their leadership development and asking them to help us plan things. So when we plan Welcome Week for their peers in the fall, we ask the students to decide what's the cool thing to do, right? I don't know what an 18-year-old wants to do on their first week in college. It's been a while since I was 18. I'm not part of Gen Z. I don't know the social media culture. So when we have students that come in to social media, that's even better because they can help tell the stories in a way that makes sense to the people with them. Our previous education director told this story about when she tried to plan a quiet study afternoon because we don't have Wi-Fi in the garden. And nobody came. They just weren't into that. It wasn't that cool. Didn't really work out. So that's why having the students is really important. And that's something over the past 7 years, the garden has really expanded, is programming for students and getting students to come and feel like it's a place they can be regularly. So I mentioned Welcome Week events. Another really huge event that we've done is Plant Adoption Day, where we talk about students how to be a plant parent. You can come and get a free plant and then take it home and actually keep it alive, right? That's like a big thing, like to empower students to be excited about plants. Another program that was really popular a few years ago and repeated a few times was called Drag Queens and Daylilies. So this program also at one point was the Rainbow Party, and they brought in drag queens to talk about these daylilies and pollination. So there was the science behind it. It was like, how do we get the different varieties of daylilies? And so the drag queens came in and they had these little paintbrushes and they were showing how they cross-pollinate the daylilies and talking about lots of things like plant sex, right? Pollination is like all of this, interesting things are happening here. It's really colorful. And this is how they drew in a wider audience to be involved in that. Here's Plant Adoption Day. They organized this. There were thousands of students who came to adopt their plant. And it's become an annual event. We had to pause it for COVID. But students come and they take a ticket when they get to the entrance, and they get to pick which plant they want. And then take home some care tips, choose the plant that's right for them. So we have this like little sort of dating sheet. You can look at it and say, oh, I have a pet. Okay, I don't want the one that's bad for pets. So I'm really good at watering my plant, or I'm not good at watering it. I have a sunny window or a shady window. You can kind of do a dating matching service for which houseplant would be right for them. All right, so moving on to another project that we're currently working on in the garden. This is the Wyman kitchen garden. And it was, the money for it was donated by the Wyman family and the Wisconsin Potato and Vegetable Grower Association. So Professor Wyman was a professor in the plant pathology department, and he did his research on plant pests and plant pathogens. And so that's why we have this wedged pie here. It's supposed to help with plant rotation. So you keep the plants healthier by making sure that tomatoes aren't growing in the same soil every year, because tomatoes attract the same pests. So if you move them around, then you'll have hopefully healthier tomatoes with fewer tomato-related pathogens. And that goes for eggplants and peppers and other things, potatoes in that same family. So I looked at this and I said, well, this is interesting. What can we do with this garden? Who can we work with to do something that's exciting and new and will bring new audiences into the garden? Because it looks really cool and we're hoping to have it built this spring, but we still need to put plants in it. This plant actually doesn't tell me anything about what plants are going to go in there. And so I started reaching out to different groups and partnering with different groups on campus. So for the past 3 or 4 years, the Native American Center for Health Professionals has been working with us to see if they can plant a Native American Three Sisters garden in our space. And because of COVID, we haven't really been able to do it. But they have these seeds that they grew in the past, and it's a really important part of their culture to be able to have certain plants to share and to get their hands in the dirt and to actually be able to grow these seeds out and turn them into plants. So one section of the garden is going to have beans and corn and pumpkins or squash. So if you know about the Three Sisters garden, then you know that these work complementary to each other. So you plant the corn and it shoots up and it provides the trellis for the beans to grow on. And then the squash and the pumpkins will spread out and provide ground cover and help with weed control and keeping the moisture in. So this is a really old and widespread indigenous tradition, and it's something that we want to be able to display so students and others can see it when they come to visit the garden. So that's one section of the garden. Then we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we did an African part of the garden? So we reached out to Yusuf Benrilla, who's a chef on campus and also runs the nonprofit Trade Routes. He does a lot of different gardens. So last summer, he had a garden by the state capitol with African diasporic crops. He's been working with a researcher at UW to do some growing at West Madison. But he had, so I talked to him and he said, okay, well, you should go to this specific seed company outside of Philadelphia and buy seeds from them. And because they have traditional seeds that have been passed down by African folks and other groups too. And also, you should really plant this plant. It's called celosia. And I was like, do we eat that? That's a food plant? It's like, yes, you can grow it. You can grow it, eat it as greens. It's really nutritious. I really love it. Here's an article I wrote recently. And here's what's really cool with this food. So that's been really fun working with him. We've also been working with students on a collaboration to write up signs for this garden and learn more about it. So a couple weeks ago, we had this class come in from, they're actually a religious studies class. So they came in and they're learning all about how food can be part of rituals and traditions, things we might consider religious or might just be more broadly spiritual and cultural. And Yusuf came, and at the end of class, we spent like a half an hour talking all about how to fry collards properly. And so that was pretty fun too, to like learn all of these things that I wouldn't otherwise know unless I had someone who had firsthand experience already growing them. The other big thing that he talks a lot about is how, well, we should just try and grow things. So there are lots of crops where people said, oh, this wouldn't grow in Wisconsin, right? It's a tropical plant, like bene seeds. People always said, oh, they wouldn't grow in Wisconsin, it's too cold here. But turns out he tried it and they grew. They've had pretty good success with basically everything they've tried, even though it's not necessarily something you would think. And then the third section, we're gonna have Hmong plants. And so I got to connected with some folks at Groundswell Conservancy, and they took me over and I met with Hmong elders who've been community gardening in Madison for a long time. And they told me, they thought for a while and they thought, you know, the plants that are really important to our community that aren't grown by anyone else in Southeast Asia are this group of herbs that we use to create a soup that we primarily feed to women after they've given birth. And so they have all of these plants. Some of them don't even have names in English. And I have to go to St. Paul at the Hmong market to get them and bring them back. Apparently at Troy Farms, they're trying next year to have a crop that are more local, but for now, St. Paul is the place to get them. And the really interesting thing about working with them is I think it's highlighting a part of horticulture in Wisconsin that we don't always think about. There are so many Hmong farmers in Wisconsin and Minnesota who grow in small plots. You probably see them at the farmers market if you go there, and they have this knowledge. They've actually even figured out how to grow rice in Wisconsin. And so I want to highlight that part of our agricultural history and contemporary practice here in the state. And the sum of this is to plan a harvest festival in the fall to share those crops. Yusuf is really big. He really wants there to be food that we can taste. And we're like, yes, food that we can, right? Like, he's like, why would you have a harvest festival if we're not going to eat the food? That's silly. And I'm like, yes, this is good, but also university regulations. So let's try and balance these things and it will be really good. But this is in the works for October 8th. We're going to have Hmong and African-American and Indigenous performing groups and students representing more information about those cultures and reports, and also some European traditions, Slavic and Scandinavian as well. All right, and then the other partnership that I've been working on is with the Wisconsin Green Muslins to think about what an Islamic garden might look like at Allen Centennial Garden. So we sort of picked out a space and I was talking to them and they're like, so you know, by the way, when we pray, we always face Mecca. So when you build a garden, you should make sure that there's a niche so people in the garden, when they're there to pray, know which direction to face. I was like, oh, that makes sense. I never would have thought of that. But it's a good thing I'm talking to you because that's something we need to do. And then the next time I met with Huda, she said, you know, Reba, your name is very close to a word in Arabic that we use to talk about the fact that in Islam, it's against the rules to collect interest. So like, this is an old Christian policy too, where it's unethical to collect interest on something when you loan money. So she said, when we set up this, we need to make sure that there's no interest involved. It's like, oh, this is good to know. When we split up money at the foundation or we collect things, we need to follow the proper practices. And again, this is something I wouldn't have known if she hadn't told me I hadn't been working with her. And then again, she said, hey, it's Ramadan now. During Ramadan, we usually raise money for things and we donate money. That's part of our culture. Could we donate money to you for this project during Ramadan? I said, well, that's great. Let's work on that. Thank you for letting me know. When we work together, we can learn all of these new things. And so we're working to figure out how to build an Islamic garden, what that would look like in Wisconsin. It's not going to look like this one, which is in Spain, of course. but it can have a lot of the same architectural elements and bring something new into the garden to try and welcome new communities that wouldn't otherwise feel welcome in our garden, which has a French and an Italian and an English garden, and then other native gardens, but no other international ones right now. So this is a beautiful, I think it was the same day as the other photo that was at the beginning of the presentation. It's probably a beautiful day in June. Doesn't look like there's any snow in the forecast, something we can look forward to. And I think that's the conclusion of my presentation. Basically, I just want to say, right, that by working with these communities, we have a much richer garden and a much richer experience for students and for visitors and for everyone who can come to enjoy the garden with us.
Questions?
Yes.
Yeah, did you have a place where you kind of experiment with some of these plants before you actually put them in the garden?
So one of the things that we have interns do often is run an intern project. And so we give them a little bit of free rein, they have a little bit of a budget, and they often experiment in different places. So this garden right here, actually, in this picture, is a kind of an example of that. So it used to be an annual garden with paths running through it. And one year the interns decided that they were going to build like topiary furniture. So they built like a couch and they wrapped it with moss or something interesting. There's another spot in the garden where they did an acidic garden down by the pond. And it's kind of an ongoing joke because they put the acidic garden downhill from a bunch of alkaline rocks. So they had a bit of trouble keeping it going. But that is something, right? We experiment with different things in different places. And the most recent experiment is on the other side of this larch, which is one of our famous trees in the garden. And there we have a tapestry garden, which is showing what, if you replaced your lawn with ground covers, it might look like.
How is the garden financed?
The garden is financed almost exclusively through donations and the endowment and money that we fundraise. So none of my salary or any of the staff salaries come from university funds. And so everything is pretty much through donation or events or programs we have. So if you come for a tour and you pay for that or those kinds of things. And we have grants now too that help us with things like the Harvest Festival.
What kind of grants?
So most recently we were awarded a grant from the Wisconsin Humanities Foundation, or Wisconsin Humanities, I don't know, they don't have like the noun at the end. Anyway, the Wisconsin Humanities gave us a $10,000 grant for the Harvest Festival. We have another small grant to do some science outreach this summer at farmers markets. Just little things that we pick up along the way.
What's your relationship with Longenecker Horticultural Gardens at the Arboretum?
We don't really have any formal relationship with David and Longenecker Gardens over there. I've been there once or twice, and we definitely communicate with other gardens on campus. So I meet occasionally with Karen Oberhauser, who's the director of the Arboretum, and also the director of the Botanic Garden on campus. And we sort of talk about strategically try and do slightly different things. Or Karen was like, oh, who's running your weddings? Oh, maybe I could have them run my weddings. Those kind of things where we collaborate.
And is the horticulture department in charge of the Longenecker Gardens, or is that the Arboretum?
No, that's the Arboretum.
So you have horticulture gardens that aren't part of the horticulture department?
I suppose so. Yes, and we're also, so there's also like the Eagle Heights Gardens, and those are separate from us too. Those are part of grounds and the Lakeshore Nature Preserve.
Yeah, those are the community gardens.
Right, they're community gardens mostly, yeah.
Parking.
Parking at the garden is always a challenge, of course, because it's on campus. So we like to say on weekends when there's no football and after 4:30, street parking on campus is free. So there's parking spots right across from the garden and within a block or two, plentiful parking in a couple different lots.
Plus lot 36 is right across the street.
Right.
That's at least it's easy as parking in Lakeshore, Lake Street, and go into the terrace.
Yes.
Any plans for the hole that is on the grounds?
Are you talking about the hole in the terrace?
Oh, the hole. The
Pardon?
house.
Host.
Oh, the house.
Yeah, the house.
I am not in charge of the house. The university is in charge of the house. It just happens to be in my garden.
Uh-oh.
So there were plans for the past, and like in 2019, 2020, 2021, possibly to turn it into a conference center. And so UW Conference Centers had a bunch of architectural plans drawn up, and they were looking for a donor for that. But they've kind of stepped back from that project now. And so we don't really know what the next step is for the building.
Since the house is right in your area, why isn't your office in it? Where is your office?
My office is in the horticulture building. So 2 directors ago, the offices were in that building until 2010. The director did have an office there, but now no one can go in the building. It's not open. We don't have keys. The raccoons and owls enjoy it, but people don't generally go in there. So it would be much more convenient. Oftentimes I like meet somebody on the front porch and I like can see them. They're like 10 yards in front of me. And I'm like chasing them down the street to go and have a meeting because I had to come from the horticulture building.
Where's the horticulture?
It's about 2 blocks south of here. So directly south of the garden is Steenbach Library. And then the next block, kitty corner, is where DC Smith Conservatory is. And that's attached to the horticulture building.
Anybody on your staff have allergies?
Oh, that's actually a really interesting question. I mean, I have seasonal allergies, but it's really common actually for people in the horticulture field to develop an allergy to the plant that they work with.
No.
So a lot of researchers will be like, oh, I worked on carrots for 20 years, so now I'm allergic to them.
When I was in horticulture, I developed an allergy to work.
That's a different kind of allergy, I think. Did you have more questions about that?
I like really clean lines. My yard is planted to passive solar with a number of big trees and gorgeous, but very simple lines and other plantings. And I think this would drive me absolutely crazy.
Way to go.
Yeah, so that's something I think we get a lot of, there's different feedback about the garden, right? So over the past 10 years or so, it's become a lot more, I would say, naturalistic. So the trend in horticulture and in our garden has been to do things that are more sustainable. So it's a lot more perennials, it's a lot more things that need less water and are native plants. And some people really like that a lot. We had the Shorewood Hills Garden Club came to visit, and our 1-hour tour turned into a 2-hour tour because they had so many questions and we were swapping stories about the prairie that they installed and the prairie that we installed and how they were developing. And then I also will get complaints regularly where they're like, why is there so much grass in the garden? Or why do you have a prairie in the garden? People can go to the Arboretum to see that. They don't need to do it on campus. As it turns out, the prairie is actually the place where classes come most often. People will come to do surveys of pest insects and surveys of pollinators, and they just really like to take pictures and enjoy that part of the garden. So we find it really valuable.
Along those lines, Karen Gunderson online asked, what are some of the things you have done to make the garden more sustainable? So if you want to repeat those or add any to them, that was a specific question.
Yeah, absolutely. So things that make the garden more sustainable are, well, there's many of them. One of them is we have a lot of volunteers, which are really fantastic. We had a new volunteer session last weekend and it was like 2/3 new people we've never had before. And that really helps us to be able to do more than we otherwise could because gardening is really time intensive. You have to work hard, like you were saying, Tom, right? Like there's so much weeding and planting. And in 2020, we weren't allowed to have any interns or any volunteers. And it was just night and day what the garden looked like and what we could do compared to like last year when they were back again. It was so much more exciting. And then again, I consider paying interns part of the sustainability too, because we're training the next generation. But I think probably what she's asking about is more like our lawns are maintained with all organic systems. So we use compost tea and aeration rather than synthetic chemicals on them. We try and reduce the amount of plants we buy and the number of pots we have to have, because plastic pots aren't really recyclable or reusable. So they just end up in the garbage, and we don't really like to do that as much as possible. And then trying to reduce the amount of watering we have to do with plants that are more adapted to this environment. So the prairie, for example, was put in the place that it was because it's a really dry clay area. And so when we were planting annuals there every year, it just took a lot of water and they didn't do very well. Whereas if you have those perennials with the deep roots, that's a much more sustainable, less water intensive solution.
The house, does it have gutters, and could you create rain gardens or rain barrels, or can you just not touch the house?
There is a rain barrel or rain garden of some sort. We actually have in-ground irrigation lines that we primarily use to reach different parts of the garden. But the house is on the historic register of places. And so is like half of the garden. So that does limit and control some of the things that we can do, because we have to have approval from the historical society. So if there aren't gutters on the house, we can't just add gutters, because then it won't be the same as it was.
I just wonder where does the rainwater go? Does it go out into the street, or does it go into the gardens?
I don't know exactly. I think primarily it comes down, but there's sewer. I mean, the house is connected to plumbing and sewer and all of those things. And some of that is connected through like building across the street and underground things. Yes.
I know there are a lot of wild animals on campus. Have any made their gardens their home?
That's a great question. So we have some old pictures. Apparently so the populations will fluctuate of these animals. So there used to be a lot more rabbits, but a couple years ago, some of them were trapped, and there's a few more foxes on campus now. So we have a much lower rabbit population. We've also had some trouble with voles. So we have vole traps up in the rock garden. If you were to go out there today, you would see these wooden boxes spread out across the rock garden, and those are there to trap voles, because otherwise they'll eat the roots of the rock garden plants. Last summer, we were pulling out the chamomile that was in the kitchen garden, and somebody found a baby vole. It was so cute, and they had to save it. And we were like, I don't know if we need to save the baby vole. Maybe save it somewhere else. We don't want grown-up voles here. But we do have predators too. So we had the red-tailed hawk would visit us regularly last summer, things like that. We also have beehives. So we have honeybees in the garden, and we try to do as much as possible to help the pollinators, the native pollinators too. So if you were in the garden right now, it would look quite weedy because we didn't cut back anything in the fall. We like to leave it until it gets to be about 50 degrees in the spring, so that the ground nesting, stem nesting bees can use that as their habitat for the winter.
When you have people bring plants from Southeast Asia, what restrictions, if any, do you have on introducing those?
I guess I don't deal with it a lot, but I do know, like, we have, like, on campus, when people bring that kind of exotic plant material onto campus or into the greenhouses, there's a protocol for quarantining them. So if you were to like go to Southeast Asia and bring a plant back with you, they wouldn't let you keep it. But if you had a permit to do it, then they would put it in quarantine and do some certain treatments to it to help prevent pests from being introduced.
And how did that work as you're establishing the Hmong garden?
So the plants that we have for the Hmong garden are grown from seeds. Seeds are different. So they're already here, and we can just grow from seed the new seedlings that we're growing.
So they're native to Southeast Asia, but then they're brought here in their seeds, so you're propagating from seed.
So we are probably going to get them as seedlings, but
Okay.
they can be propagated from seed. So it's possible to bring plants, introduce them, and quarantine them to make sure that they don't have pests. And people do that, like the USDA has a program and things like that. Yes.
Yeah, there's someone with an experienced eye. What other gardens in the area do you enjoy visiting?
What other? Ooh, that's a good question. I really like Old Brick a lot. I live over on the east side of town. They also have excellent shows. I have a toddler who really likes to visit Old Brick. He got to go to the train show, which was really fantastic. And then the spring garden show, which was almost as fantastic, so fantastic, he wasn't even mad at me that there weren't trains because there were rubber duckies. So that was very exciting. What else? So I wrote my whole dissertation about the Chicago Botanic Garden. So I'm a big fan of that. We could talk about that for an hour also, but maybe another day.
And which one is that?
Chicago Botanic Garden is located north, about a half an hour north of downtown Chicago. It's located on the northern end of the Skokie Lagoons. So it has this beautiful 7-island construction where everything is surrounded by water.
That garden, just of interest, was actually a dump. And when I was in high school, they had stopped doing it as a dump and they were trying to convert it. And we would hop fences and go there, drink and do things.
Yeah, that
Who's
whole
your
area.
parole officer?
Never got caught. But those gardens are, because I lived very close to there when I was a kid. They're beautiful. And it just blows me away that this was this like toxic dump site that, you know, we're stealing beer out of people's garage and going there to drink it. So.
Well, and even before that, it was just this marsh that would like catch fire. And it was actually the largest WPA project, or Civilian Conservation Corps project in the nation, was to turn the Skokie Marsh into lagoons.
Yeah.
And how does that, what's the relationship between that, if any, and the Garfield Park Conservatory, which is a greenhouse?
There isn't any formal relationship between the two of them.
So one's part of the Chicago Park District and the other is independent?
So Chicago Botanical Garden is it's located on the forest preserves of Cook County land. And it's actually part of the Chicago Horticultural Society.
But it's not part of the city of Chicago.
Right.
Because I think it's by like Northbrook and Northfield.
Right. It's in Glencoe, I believe.
Okay, yeah, they all kind of like merge together.
But anyway, so my dissertation research was all about public programs at this garden, which is why I'm all about public programs now. So it was all about community gardening and horticultural therapy and school garden programs in Chicago and how those were funded and how they changed over the period of time when the garden was founded. And the Horticultural Society moved from downtown Chicago to be out in the northern suburbs. All right, so I have a few more slides here to just talk about some upcoming things that are happening at Allen Centennial Garden. We have Family Gardening Day on May 7th. So this is in collaboration with different partners on campus, DC Smith Greenhouse, Steenbach Libraries. And basically it's an opportunity to bring out kids and people of different ages to come to the garden, do some fun hands-on things and bring home plants. So it's 10 to 1, it's free. There might be some free tokens to get ice cream if you come.
Did you say there might be free tokens to get ice cream?
There might be free tokens to get ice cream and also free plants. So you can bring home some different vegetable starts and other things and learn about bees.
Babcock Hall ice cream?
What'd you say?
Would that be Babcock Hall ice
It
cream?
would, if it was happening, it would definitely be Babcock Hall ice cream.
I love
Right
the
around the
condition.
corner from there.
Yes. So that's upcoming. I'm very excited about it as a parent of a toddler who naps in the afternoon because it's in the morning. So most things seem to happen in the afternoons and that's in the morning. We also have lunchtime wellness, which goes back to that restorative aspect. So every Thursday around lunchtime, we have a different free activity in the garden. Sometimes it's yoga or meditation. Sometimes it's painting or doing flower pounding or learning about bees, all kinds of different things. People will come and eat their lunch and visit us in the garden. We have a summer concert series, which happens on Sunday afternoons from 5 to 6:30 in the garden. That's a great time to come down. Parking is more available on campus and it's free on the surface lots. And we have different jazz concerts. And so it happens every other Sunday evening starting in June. And then we're doing a new program this year called Market Science. So we'll be in July and August on some Saturdays at the West Side Farmers Market and the Hilldale Market, talking about different science research happening on campus in collaboration with students who are going to help us share their stories and the things that are going on so we can teach them about how to communicate science as well. And then, like I mentioned, the Harvest Festival, which I'm really excited about. We'll have performing groups on one side of the garden student work on the other side, and some hands-on activities to learn and think more about our own heritage and how plants are really essential to our lives and our survival.
Can you talk more about the getting permission from the university to serve food?
Oh, yes. So the university has lots of various regulations. So there are certain places you can park on campus. There are certain caterers that we have to ask to help us with things. So like if you're booking an event on campus of any kind, we have on-campus catering from University Dining and the union. And so you have to go and ask them first if they want to give you food, and then you can ask other people to help you. For example, but there's also like health and safety requirements too. So we have to make sure that we're making sure that we have all of the right equipment to serve food at the right temperature, and we're doing all of the food safety, food handling things that we need to do. And we fill out all the right forms, things like that. I don't know, we're talking about like, how do you get a food truck on campus? It's not as simple as calling up the food truck and having them park in the garden. There's a lot more steps.
Yeah, we went through that 3 years ago with science expeditions, and I'll be done with therapy in another 2 years.
It's like the same thing. It's right. Like you want to get something printed, you have to go to Staples if Staples will do it, or University Printing. Like those are your two choices.
But eating, like, since it's a harvest festival and just have vegetables and fruits at hand, is that an issue?
Well, there's a lot of food safety practices around harvesting and maintaining vegetables. So that's something that if we want to do that, we have to keep in mind. So there are certain rules about how, like if we put fertilizer down or certain pesticides, you have to do that a certain number of days before you're going to harvest. And then you have to wash the produce in a certain way before you can eat it. And then there's rules about if you give it away for free versus if you charge. So apparently a few years ago, there was an issue with a group on campus that was doing CSAs. And then somebody got sick, I don't know, some sort of food poisoning from the produce, which, you know, happens in general if you don't wash your lettuce. Sometimes there's things on there you don't want to eat. And so they kind of got in trouble. So now they can only give food away. They can't sell it. So there's different legal rules because the university has a lot of money. So you have to make sure that you do as much as possible to mitigate people suing you for things. That's just how it works.
All right, thanks again.